Okay, well, thank all of you who've joined us today for another rendition and another month of the University of Idaho, Utah State University, and South Dakota State University collaborative sheep and goat webinar. This has been a very successful webinar series that was originally started by the University of Idaho and by our two speakers that are speaking today with us. Um, Today, we'll be talking about making selection and culling decisions for your herd or flock from our two specialists. So first, we have Dr. Belinda Ellison, who is the extension specialist, extension sheep specialist at the University of Idaho, and does a pretty large amount of sheep work and a work of grazing animals on range and has a pretty diverse portfolio. We also have Carmen Wilmore, who's a county extension educator in Bingham County in Idaho. And so we're really lucky to hear them today. Dr. Ellison, feel free to go ahead and take it away. Thank you.
Great, thanks, Chad. So Carmen and I have been discussing this over the week, and we are going to bring you some information on making selection and culling decisions. So I'm going to start off with some of the selection parts of this, and then she'll take over and discuss culling. The timing, I think, is probably timely as far as most production systems, because we're raising up our yearling animals that we may be putting back into the herd as replacements. And there's probably many of our ewes and does that we shouldn't be breeding back that we can cull accordingly. So as we go forward here, let me make sure my clicker is working. There it goes. So just as a reminder to what we're going to be separating out here, culling, we're going to be discussing more of the removal of animals that we already have. Maybe they have negative traits or something's going on with them that is not going to meet your production goals. And so you want to get rid of those animals so you can increase your genetic capability and your production ability. Selection, on the other hand, and these may be animals that you already have, but they're the new ewes and does that are going to be coming into your flock as replacement animals, and you're going to want to make sure that you're selecting those animals based on what they can bring to your flock as far as your genetic potential and your production capabilities. So the biggest thing that we see a lot is that eyeball test, right? So we have all these animals that are born and we like the way that they look, and so we choose them. Maybe it's based on they were born first, or maybe they just have a nice conformation, or maybe their mother, you remember her being a good mother, that kind of thing. And we do that a lot, and it's really hard to break that cycle. But the problem with doing that is a lot of the genetic potential in these animals is not something that you can visually see. So how do we improve that? How do we make better decisions when it comes to selecting animals, culling animals, that type of thing? And the biggest thing here is actually keeping physical records on each of your animals. So we can talk about kind of what those look like and what types of records you should be keeping, but really it's making sure that you're keeping records on things that are going to be important for your production system. So one of the big things that we can do to make sure we're really working towards the right place and making the right progress is sitting down on some rainy day, maybe one day, and you're working up some of those, production objectives and your management goals, and what exactly are we trying to get to? So maybe you have a flock that you would like to have better, meat production out of, and write that down. What are we gonna do? Do we need animals that mature more quickly? Do we need animals that grow to be a certain size? Do we need animals that are better mothers? Whatever it is, we need to get that on paper and make sure that we really understand that's the direction we're going to go. And then once we know the direction that we're going to go, it's a good idea to sit down with all of the resources that you have and say, okay, what do I need to have here to be able to meet this goal? So if I'm going to have animals that mature in 10 months to 160 pounds and finish out at that carcass weight or at that mature body weight, what information do I need to make sure that I have on these animals to make that goal a reality? So when you sit down and say, okay, does that mean I need to buy some more tools? Do I need to have a scale? Do I need to have this, that? Do I need to weigh my lambs when they're born? Those types of things are all things you have to think about, you know, but having that information is going to help you achieve those goals more quickly and being able to select animals that are going to get you there. And then, of course, looking back at some point and saying, okay, did I achieve what I was aiming to achieve? So as we're looking at the different selection criteria that we could be using to select animals, again, going back to those goals, what is exactly that you're trying to achieve in your flock or your herd? And it's going to be different for everybody, right? We all have a different environment that we're raising animals in. We have a different end goal that we're targeting. If we're just weaning lambs and selling them, or we're making milking does, or we're whatever it is, there's going to be different goals for each individual operation. And it's important to just sit down and think, what is exactly that I'm trying to go? So we can go anywhere from those really big growth characteristics, fast growing, meaty animals. We could have more of an influence on some of those softer genetics like longevity, reproductive ability, milking ability, mothering ability, those kinds of things. And we also could be selecting on multiple traits. So in my flock, for example, I raise animals that are end products. I raise them clear to finish and sell them to direct to consumer. But it's really important to me, if I'm going to be lambing in January, that my ewes are able to mother those lambs and I don't have to do all the work. So I do kind of a multiple trait selection system, and there's nothing wrong with that. In fact, a lot of times you're going to make more progress doing multiple traits as long as you don't get carried away than if you just choose one and stick to it. The other thing is understanding who exactly are we selecting. So when you're selecting the sires in your flock or herd, they are going to be where you can gain the most rapid momentum as far as your genetic ability in your flock or herd, because they're going to be breeding multiple ewes and does. So we're going to get multiple offspring from one animal. Whereas when you're selecting the ewes and does, you're only getting one per ewe or doe that you're selecting. But I think it's important to still look at both. So we're going to put a higher influence on the sires because we can make the most progress with one sire than we can with one ewe or doe. But it's still important, I think, to look at both. So when we select sires, we're obviously looking at, especially if we're using any kind of genetic background on them, having that pedigree, understanding what their EPDs are and that type of thing. And those are also going to be gained through progeny performance. So if they have a proven track record of, offspring that can give you some idea of their performance. Not everybody's selecting on genetic EPDs and that type of thing with the sires, but some people are. But the more offspring that those sires have, the more accurate the information that we have is going to be. So the dams, on the other hand, same kind of situation. If we have some understanding of her mother, her grandmother, her sire, all of those things, that's her pedigree. But also, we get to be 4 or 5 years old and our ewes and does, we can start to understand how their progeny has performed as well. So this is where having those records is really important, because you can't remember every single animal. I mean, we all like to think we do, but there's only those handful that we remember, and it's either something really good happened or something really bad happened. There's a lot of those ones that kind of fall in the middle, right? And it would be handier to make selection decisions on something that we wrote down. And I'm as guilty as anybody for making selection decisions without records, but I think if we can strive to have those records that we look back on the day before we go out and make physical selection decisions, then we're making better choices as we go forward. So what do we want to focus on as far as the traits that we're selecting for? We obviously want to try to go for traits that are more heritable, that we can almost guarantee that the offspring are going to pick up at least some of. As we know, they are going to get half of their material, their genetic material, from their mother and half from their father. And so the more heritable the trait is, the more likely it is to be passed down. And so when we're talking about things like growth traits, carcass characteristics, even lactation, milking ability, those types of things, they're going to be moderate to high heritability. And so when we're selecting on those, we know that, okay, if I choose this ewe or doe or this sire because of their growth potential, they're going to pass at least a good portion of that down to their offspring. When we're talking about reproductive ability, those are lowly heritable traits, mothering instinct, longevity, how well they get a lamb up and going. Those types of things are not super heritable genetically. And so those are records we should still be keeping, because if you have animals that are raising offspring, those offspring are going to have learned behavior that comes from being raised by that animal. But you're not going to take a ram or a buck and say, okay, this ram came from a really good mother, I'm going to pass that genetically down. That's not going to work. It's got to be more learned. So these are all things that we have to kind of think about when we're looking at traits. We also can look at traits that are correlated with one another. If we're trying to target, say, a better growth potential, we might want to target a higher birth weight or a higher weaning weight, that type of thing. And that way we can actually quantify how that's going before we actually reach the end result. It's also going to be important to understand what your resources are as far as what types of records you can keep. Your management style, you don't want to have to change everything that you're doing just to be selecting on one trait, unless it's going to gain you enough to make up for that change in management. Understanding your markets and the strengths and weaknesses of your production system, those are all really important when we talk about selection. And then we also, of course, I've said it a couple of times already, but we just want to make sure those traits are traceable. So if we're going to be selecting on something, we want to be able to quantify whether we're gaining in that department at all. So body weight, carcass characteristics, parasite resistance is one that we haven't discussed yet, but if you have an animal that is always wormy and you're always having to do something with her, she's probably not the best one to keep daughters out of. And then if we're raising replacements, obviously those selection decisions are really important as far as choosing which one stays, which one goes. If you're going to buy replacements, it's also nice to have a source where they have those records and they can give you some kind of a track record on those animals, so that when you're bringing them into your herd or flock, you're getting something that you really want rather than just whatever is left over from that guy's flock, We usually want to target a replacement rate of 15 to 20%, because that's what you should actually be culling on the back end, or that's what, not necessarily you should be, but a lot of times that's how it's going to fall. So if you're going to try to keep your herd or flock at the same level, you're going to target this 15 to 20% real replacement rate. So there's a couple ways that you can do selection. One of them is just single trait selection. So if you're picking one thing and you're going to aim for the moon on it, you're going to pick animals that are superior for it. You can gain a lot of momentum doing that, and you have a lot of potential for genetic improvement. You can change your overall flock or herd in that trait very quickly, and it's easy to do. So you just say, okay, I'm taking the top 15% of these animals in this trait and I'm keeping them, and everything else goes down the road. It's not always the most practical thing, though. We see it a lot in places like the dairy industry when we're selecting specifically just for milk production, or in the chicken industry where we're selecting for egg size or breast size or whatever. So when we do that, we have to be really careful, because we can really increase one trait, but we can have a negative effect on other traits. So for example, in the dairy industry, when we're selecting for milking ability, that can really decrease a lot of important traits that may matter to you and your system, which is, all of these dairy animals, they don't grow quite as quickly. They don't have the same type of mothering ability, that type of thing. So you have some of those negative correlations with other traits when we put that heavy of an emphasis on one. Another way that you can do selection is an independent culling level. So you're basically saying two or more traits. Usually in this type of a system, you're going to just keep it to a handful or less of traits that you're going to look for. But basically what you're going to do is you're going to say, okay, this is the line. I'm keeping all the animals above the line for their performance, which I'll show you here. So say we want to have animals that are gaining 0.7 pounds a day in their growing phase. So we would keep all of the animals above this 0.7 line. So you can see that would include all of these up here. And then we say also we would like to have our yearling weight be 120 pounds in these animals. So now we've got this quadrant up here in the corner that we're selecting. So you can see how it sort of brings down the specific animals that fall into both of those categories. So this can be applied all at one time, or you can do it periodically throughout the year. So say you reach weaning weight, and weaning weight is one of the things that's important to you. Cut anything that hasn't reached that certain weaning weight by that certain point in time. And then, 3 months later, you're making a selection decision on which ewe lambs to keep. You're gonna say, okay, these ones didn't grow very well, so we're gonna get rid of them and keep these top tier. Or you can apply it all at the same time. And the con in this particular situation is that just because they are superior in one trait, it doesn't always mean that they're going to be compensating for another trait, which you can see here. Like our best sized ewe lamb here isn't necessarily growing at the same rate as some of these other ones. And so a little bit smaller, but grows faster. You have to kind of compensate for those. Another way that, and I don't have it written here, I apologize, but it's an index selection. So this is one where you can weight different traits and you can use as many as you want. So you basically put a value on each trait. So maybe you have a higher importance on weaning weight and then maybe a little bit lower importance on milk production, and you can add them all up with the weighted value, which would give you an index value. And then you can compare those animals all across the board. You can put as many traits as you want into an index, but it doesn't always eliminate the ones that are inferior in a specific trait if they compensate for it in some other traits. But this is probably the one that's going to be the way that you can select on multiple things and still make progress in multiple different traits. So one of the things that I like to discuss when we're talking about gaining genetic potential in a flock or herd, there's a couple of ways that we can really gain more ground. So one of them is to increase your selection intensity, which essentially just means being more choosy about the animals that you pick. So say you have 100 lambs that you're choosing from, and you're going to keep 50 of them. That means half the animals are staying and half of them are going. If you become more choosy in that you would only keep 20 rather than 50, you're going to be picking that top 20% rather than the top 50%. So of course, you're going to make more progress doing it that way. And you also want to decrease the average age of your herd. So the idea here is, especially when it comes to your sires, you're going to replace those sires more often. So instead of keeping a sire around for 4 or 5 years, you might cull your bucks at 3 years old. And that way, every time you bring a new one in, you're making more genetic progress. Same thing with your ewes and does. If you are able to cull them at age 6 and bring in more new ones, the more progress you're going to make. And of course, if we increase the accuracy of our selection, that just means having better records, making sure that when we are selecting animals, it's because they really are going to perform that way and not just because we think they might. So again, this is just an example of that intensity. If you were to have 100 ewe lambs, you're going to be selecting those top 50, you're going to be gaining a half a pound a year. If you select the top 25, you might gain 0.8 pounds per year. And if you select only 10 out of those 100, you're going to gain a 1.1 pounds per year when it comes to gain. And so that just increases your chances of making that progress much faster, to do it in a way that there's really taking those superior animals and not pulling in other ones below them. So just to kind of wrap up the selection portion, we have a lot of ways that we can use selection of one trait to influence another trait, and we have these correlations. So of course, one way that we can do that is by the use of indicator traits. So some examples of that would be weaning weight is going to be very correlated with yearling weight and mature size and that type of thing. So if we're selecting at weaning, we have a likely chance that we're going to have better yearling weights and better mature body weight in those animals if we select at weaning. So we're picking those traits that are correlated, and we're using the one that happens earlier. So a lot of times, and this may be more common in the beef industry, but we can select on scrotal circumference of our sires to increase the fertility and decrease the age of puberty in our female offspring. So these are things that you can do without having to wait till they're full grown and showing you what their potential is. Those are indicator traits. So we have a lot of those types of things that we can target, but we also, again, have to be careful of that indirect selection causing issues in traits that are correlated that are not favorable. So when we are selecting animals that are growing faster and bigger, higher weaning weight, higher yearling weight, you're also going to be seeing offspring that are born heavier birth weights. We may have more trouble having those lambs or kids come out, that birthing ease. When we have really growthy animals that are growing really fast, and this is why you see that in the dairy industry, that we select on milk and we have poor growth as a result. It's the same way the other way around. If we're selecting for that really high growth rate and fast maturing animals, then growth characteristics, you're going to start to see your milking ability and your reproductive ability suffer a little bit. So it's not that putting some emphasis on it is going to cause you a ton of trouble, but if you are solely selecting on specific things, you get that bad indirect feedback. So with that, I've got that all covered, and I'm going to let Carmen take over on the culling decisions.
Thanks, Melinda. Did I just stop sharing that?
Yes, you did.
Oh my gosh. Okay. Give me 1 second. I'll get it back. Okay. Is it back now?
We got your presenter view. So just change your display settings up at the top. And then switch screens. Yeah, there you go.
Not working?
Okay, you're good.
Okay. Great. So thanks, Melinda, for going over selection. So she was talking a lot about how to decide what animals you want to keep in your flock or herd. And now I get my turn to talk about which ones we're going to send down the road. So I'll be talking about culling. So obviously those are the animals that are really no longer contributing to the profitability of your operation, right? And so each operation kind of has to decide at what point that animal is no longer beneficial to their herd or flock. But some key factors to consider there are, is the animal healthy enough to rebreed and raise their offspring? Obviously, if they can't get rebred or raise, lambs or kids, they're not going to be a part of your herd anymore. And so you have to decide if you're going to, process them locally for meat, or if you're going to sell them in some other facet. But that's usually the time for most people that they move on. Also think, will that animal require extra care? And are you capable of providing that for your operation? So I'll talk about that in a few different instances. Some animals might be able to have more longevity, but they're going to take extra care. And it's usually a financial cost to you as the operator that's going to have to decide if that's worth it or not. And then also, what do they add to your operation? So Melinda talked a lot about decreasing the age of your herd to help increase those selection criteria and the advancement that you can make. But if you have really good sires or dams in your herd that you would like to get more offspring out of them, that's another thing that you have to consider when to cull those really high genetic potential animals. So the first thing, when people think about culling, they always think about the age of the animal. And with our pasture-raised animals, they tend to peak in their performance between ages 5 and 7. And so once that they have reached that peak performance, after that, obviously they're going to start to go down. And so as they go down, they might have more issues with their udder, if they have been nursing kids. Is there any damage to the udder, things like that. And especially in our animals that are on a pasture environment, they have to cover more terrain. And so another thing to look for is their feet and legs, if they're still in good condition, especially in rougher terrain, that they can still, make it to water and out to graze without a lot of, resistance in their feet and legs. And then we have animals that are raised more in confinement and more of like a hay, grain, or TMR scenario. Those animals usually will meet their peak performance between ages 6 and 8. And again, that age range can really change based on how they're being raised in confinement. So if they're part of an accelerated breeding, they're going to be giving birth to kids more rapidly, and also they're going to be having a lot more lactation. And so that's going to also, take a lot out of their condition, and can also decrease kind of when they hit that peak. It might be hit at a younger age versus if they're, raised in confinement, but maybe they're more of a dairy setting where they're going to be giving, birth once a year, maybe once every year and a half, and then lactating for a longer period of time. Those might actually have more of a peak performance at like age 8, and then you might get a few more bonus years after that. Things to pay attention there are, again, their feet and leg condition. When they are being raised in confinement, they're usually going to be on either cement flooring, slotted flooring, or even deep bedded barns. And all three of those scenarios can have pros and cons to their feet and leg condition. Especially with deep bedding, it's really soft on their feet, and so they can get overgrown toes and kind of have splayed out feet, just because those feet will get overgrown pretty quickly when they don't have that rougher flooring to kind of work down their feet and keep them more hard and have less hoof trimming ideally. Whereas with harder floors, that's just going to be harder on their legs. Just over time, they'll get more, sore knees and joints and things like that. Also, in confinement, you have to think about overconditioning and the impacts that has on their health. So some animals in these scenarios, they're going to become pretty overweight. And so they have extra weight on their body that they're having to carry, and that has negative impacts, as well as on their conception rate. When they are overweight, they're going to have a harder time breeding back. And so you just have to be kind of aware of those animals that do become overconditioned in these environments, and probably change your ration to decide if they're always overconditioned and they're just kind of an overweight, obese type animal, probably culling them, because they're going to have a hard time breeding back as the years go on. So the next thing that we look at when we're culling animals is their udders and teats. All of our breeding animals, right, have to they're either a sire used for breeding, or they're a female that it's going to be pregnant and then have to raise that animal. And the udders and teats are very important to that. And so when we look at animals, we really pay attention to how the udder is attached. And so in this picture in the top left, kind of the middle one, you can see that kid is just like a day old, and it's already having to like tilt its neck just to get down under that teat to nurse. And so over time with udders like that, they're going to get lower and lower as the dam gets older, and they can start dragging on the ground if they get to a certain point, which has a lot of negative implications. They can get caught on things and damaged that way. Whereas if you look at the Bordeaux in the bottom, that kid is a couple weeks old and is still able to just stand and nurse really comfortably. So she has a much better attached udder. And that's something, especially in like pasture environments or even in confinement where they're laying down, if they're poorly attached, they're more at risk for those udders and teats to get stepped on by the other animals, which can also cause damage. Bulbous teats, like shown in that other picture there, those are just really hard for the kids to get their mouths around when they're needing to be nursed. And so that can cause you to then have to raise the offspring. And so that's another reason for culling. Nursing multiple kids can cause scarring and more incidences of mastitis, which if you have an animal with mastitis, it's not an automatic reason to cull them. It just depends on what bacteria has caused the mastitis, if you're going to be able to treat them and they make a full recovery or not. And so that's something that'll be case by case, and you have to work with your veterinarian on treatment protocols to decide what you want to do with those animals. Any animal with a damaged or torn udder or a hard or lumpy udder is probably going to need to be culled, because those are pretty much impossible to recover from. So teeth and mouth, initially you have to identify animals with over or under bites. And so I have pictures of those in the bottom. If you have them, they're pretty obvious to see. Those animals should not be used for breeding. They're easy to identify when they're young, and just turn them into a market project and put them down the road that way. Because those conditions over time are going to make it more difficult for that animal to graze and consume any other type of foraging grain. And then they also just aren't able to properly chew and digest the food, because their teeth don't align correctly for proper chewing. At 4 years old, most sheep and goats have all of their permanent teeth. And so at that point in time, you can kind of use that as a way to age animals, especially if you're buying new animals, by looking at their teeth and kind of some of these diagrams. You're able to see if they have, the teeth of a 4-year-old or the teeth of a 2-year-old. And then after they get past that 4-year-old point, that's when those teeth start to wear down a little bit more. They can also start losing some alignment. They can also lose teeth, especially if they have like forages that are really thorny, things like that, that might get stuck in between the gum and the tooth, that can cause them to lose teeth. So it's important, especially as animals get in those older years, to at least on an annual basis look at their teeth and just see how many they have left, especially if they're kind of getting skinny and you look and they don't have full mouth of teeth. That's probably another good time to decide, maybe I'm going to cull this animal. It's not able to adequately, forage for itself and digest that ration. Then it's not going to be as productive as the others in the herd. So really quick, I'll go over a little bit of structural correctness. This is really important, especially when you're evaluating your mature does and ewes, to be able to kind of, like Melinda was saying, like you use that eyeball test. And this is actually probably more of the time to do it, right? You just need to look and make sure, are they of the right frame size that I want? Are their hips and pelvis kind of in the right positioning for them to be a good breeding animal? So they have a strong level top, long rump, and then that slight slope from hooks to pins. And that becomes really important actually in our females, as they need to be able to give birth, right? So if they have narrow hips, or if that slope is, too straight or too steep, they're actually going to have more difficulty when it comes time to give birth. And so they need to be able to have a good open pelvis and more wide hips for that birthing process. You can even notice, when you see those comparisons and then you're there when they're giving birth, sometimes those animals that are a little bit more narrow are actually going to have more dystocia. So you might have to help them more, because when that kid gets lined up, if that pelvis and the hips aren't perfectly aligned, that's when you start seeing, their body turn and they're coming sideways, or they're coming with their hips, or their head is turned back, because that pelvic opening isn't wide enough for them to get lined up and pushed out. Also, one thing to look for is that fluid movement with the back feet filling in the front footprints of front feet. So that sounds kind of silly to like watch them as they walk like that, but when you do it, you actually can kind of see if there's any issues in their feet and legs with the alignment and how those feet are put together. Just the more structurally correct that they are, the longer that they're going to last, because there's not going to be so much wear and tear on their joints. Another important thing to look at are hooves and legs. They're really important for the longevity of breeding animals because, you know, they have to be able to get around and get around easily for a long time to be in your herd for a long time with a long life. It is important to have regular maintenance for an animal's hooves, but if you're noticing every time that you trim hooves, there's this one animal that it's always like splayed out like this, or, you know, they're always off to the side or something like that, that probably means that they have some structural issues as well that maybe you're not seeing just with your blind eye, but as you're trimming the hooves, you'll kind of start to pick up on that over time. And so some animals that are having to have those extra hoof trimming, or they just seem to get lame more often, that's another reason for culling, because they're not going to be as productive, right? They're not going to be able to get up and graze as easily during breeding season. If they're not up and moving around, they may not get bred as easily by your buck or ram. Also, overgrown feet, soft claws can cause issues with mobility and survival, even when they're out on pasture. You know, if there's predator issues and they're not able to get away, that's another issue. And so on the bottom, I have just a few examples of what those feet and leg issues can look like. And so again, if they're in or out and not just straight, like in that first picture, that's another reason for culling. So then when you get to lambing and kidding season, this is where Melinda was talking about keeping good records. So if you have any incidences of dystocia, having to do a lot of manipulation of the kids inside, or the mother just has a really hard time with giving birth, those are all things to keep track of and potentially have to cull them based on that. The kids' vitality, so how strong those kids come out, good thing to keep record of. The causes of mortality. With kids and lambs, there's almost always going to be some incidences of mortality, but a lot of it you got to think about what caused it. So was it starvation of the kid or lamb? Were they not able to nurse from their mother? Did she not have milk or colostrum? Would she not let them nurse because of her own, you know, poor mothering instinct? Things like that. And then obviously anything that has a uterine prolapse should be culled. You know, it's just a good production practice once they prolapse to get rid of that animal. And don't just sell them at the sale barn. Make sure to, you know, process them for meat or euthanize them so that they're not put at risk when they move on to, if they were to move on to another operation. Also, if you have to do any like heavy manipulation within the uterus and you think you've caused a uterine tear, or there's a really significant uterine infection in that animal after they've given birth, that's another reason to cull, even if it's cleared up over time. If they're an older animal, you just don't want to risk that there was damage done and then they're going to be pregnant again, and you know, it may not be successful the second time around. Also look for poor mothering instincts and milk production. So after giving birth, some does and ewes can be really aggressive. It's normal for them to push away other lambs and kids that are trying to nurse from them. But if they're actually aggressive towards those other lambs and kids, that's something to be aware of and concerned of, that they may actually harm those other kids and lambs, and you don't want to end up with injured animals because of another dam in the herd. So that's a reason for culling. If they're not interested in nursing or licking off their kids, again, that mothering instinct really should kick in. And if they are not able to give birth, get up, lick those babies off and get them up and nursing within a good amount of time, like less than an hour, have those kids or lambs licked off and start trying to get them up to nurse. That's a reason for culling as well, especially in a system where you're depending on the dam to do that. If that's how you're set up, then they should be able to do it. And if not, then replace them with someone that can. Also low milk supply, which that can be caused by a variety of things, but if you're seeing where their offspring are going to other mothers in the herd to nurse, then that means that they don't have enough milk to supply for their own kids and lambs, and should be replaced. So parasite tolerance, most animals should be able to withstand some level of parasitic load, and perform well without constant intervention. Depending on your operation, you probably have some type of deworming protocol, whether that's once a year, twice a year, or just whenever necessary. But if you have individual animals that you're having to treat repeatedly, or not responding to treatment, probably need to be culled. Parasites is definitely an issue in our small ruminants. And as some animals are more prone to those, so will their offspring. And so it's good to keep records of how many times you're having to treat that animal and whether or not they're responding, and then cull based on that. Reproductive and abortion diseases. Probably the most important here is obviously brucellosis. It is most commonly seen in the 4th month of pregnancy, and it is a lifelong infection in adults. In the US, we test all of our dairy animals for this, and any positive animals have to be euthanized. I wouldn't say it's super common to see, but it is very important if this is contracted by your herd to euthanize those animals. You probably have to work with a state veterinarian to do that properly, but it's pretty serious and should be managed accordingly. There are other abortive diseases that can affect sheep and goats. Each operation kind of has to decide how to handle those. So, like toxoplasmosis, chlamydia, things like that, that can be contracted by your herd and spread within it. It doesn't mean you have to cull every single animal that came into contact with it. You should treat them. And depending on how they respond to treatment and your veterinarian's recommendations, then you can decide on what animals should be culled and why. And then you also have to think about those animals' reproductive ability following, contraction of some of these diseases, or just throughout their lifespan. If they're able to conceive during that first kind of 21 to 24 days with the buck, that's good. We want a close lambing and kidding window. If they have early abortions or are late to conceive, those are things to watch out for, especially animals that have aborted like more than once. It's common for an animal to abort at least one time during their life, but if it seems like they're conceiving and aborting and then conceiving and aborting over and over again, there's probably something going on internally, that they're not going to be able to carry that fetus to parturition and need to be culled for that. Also, if you have animals that are breeding out of season and you like to have a close breeding season, you can cull based on that. You put them in with the buck or the ram for, 3 to 6 weeks, and whatever isn't bred during that time period can be culled because they weren't able to conceive. So there are 3 incurable diseases that affect our sheep and goats. And if animals are found in your herd that have these diseases, they should be culled. And when they are positive for these diseases and you decide to cull them, they should not be resold. They should either be euthanized or used for meat processing. So take them to a local processor and have them processed into meat. And then you can kind of decide based on your education of these diseases on how to use that meat. CL, in this top picture, I have a picture of where you might locate CL abscesses on sheep and goats. They're contagious abscesses. If animals test positive, they should be isolated and culled immediately because that CL virus is transmitted through saliva. And so if they're drinking out of a communal water tank, they can contaminate other animals in the herd. CIE is caprine arthritis encephalitis. It is what it sounds like. It's arthritis, lameness, unthriftiness, and specifically in females, it can also cause a hard udder, which decreases their milk production. it can pass to offspring, and so animals should be culled immediately. In dairies, they are known to heat treat their colostrum and milk to prevent the CAE transmission to offspring. But that doesn't work in all diseases, it just works in CAE. But again, those animals don't have to be automatically culled, as would be with CL, but they should be culled after that lactation is over so that it's not transmitted to offspring in the future. Johne's disease is a chronic wasting disease. It is also contagious, and if found in the herd, all those that were positive should be culled. And so that Johne's disease is also can also affect other ruminants. So cattle commonly have Johne's disease as well, and it can be transmitted between small ruminants and large ruminants. So another thing to look at is your individual animal performance. So depending on your operations goals, you're going to be looking at the number of kids and lambs born versus the number survived to weaning. So like we were saying earlier, mortality can be impacted by many things in those young ages, but if it is on fault of the dam itself, definitely keep record of that, whether she wasn't getting it up. If she didn't get it licked off, if she didn't get it up and nursed, or if she didn't have enough milk for it, those would all be something that would be a negative trait of the mother. Instances of triplets and quads. Some operations want to have triplets and quads, some don't. It just depends on you if you have the manpower to feed those extra kids and lambs. If you don't, and you only want them to have singles and twins, then you're going to select against those females that seem to be having triplets and quads. They do seem to, like if a doe or a ewe is having singles and twins after the first or second gestation, if they're on their third kidding and they're still having singles and twins, they're probably going to continue to have singles and twins past there. If they are having quads and triplets at their second or third kidding or lambing, that will probably continue as well. There is some influence of the sire and their fertility as well as nutrition on that, but also there is some impact of the doe's ability to ovulate and carry those to to parturition. Also look at the birth weights of those animals as well as their weaning weights. Like Melinda was saying, you don't want to select for too large of birth weights because it can cause issues with dystocia. And so just keep track of those things and make sure if they're having really, really big kids and lambs and they're having a lot of issues getting those out, that would be a reason to cull. Or if they're having very small birth weights, very weak lambs and kids that take a lot of extra care, you can also cull and kind of select against that as well. Feed conversion can be kind of hard to calculate in our herd and flock situations, but essentially that is the amount of feed consumed for the pounds of kids and lambs weaned. And so you just have to kind of consider the conversion of your herd overall. And if there's animals that seem to be very overweight, but maybe their offspring aren't as, large and doing as well as some of those other animals that aren't as overweight, you can cull against that as well. So thinking of our males, which I've not really focused too much on them, because when you get to the point where you've already selected for what you want out of your sires, and so now you're just kind of deciding, okay, when am I going to get rid of them? When am I going to replace them with a new buck or ram? Obviously, single testicles or crypt orchid, you would not use as a breeding animal, but I still wanted to put that in here. If something were to happen that damaged one of the testicles, you would need to